Hello, everybody. Welcome to our live webinar. This is the first in a series of many to come, where we're going to discuss a lot of interesting topics related to automation, AI, APIs, and the convergence of all these in the enterprise domain to drive, productivity and other enterprise improvements. My name is Darko Vukovic, and I'm the CEO founder of Poly API. Prior to this, I was at Google and MuleSoft and Oracle, always in the API space, building platforms as a service for the enterprise space. This webinar is meant to be a complement to the videos and content that we produce, which are very technical in nature. They're very hands-on, down in the code. But these webinars are more so meant to be more higher level discussions around business strategy, concepts, new paradigm shifts, what impact that's having in our industry, and then also very pertinent to enterprises that want to adopt this technology to kind of have a better understanding of it and how to apply it. Today, I'm very fortunate to have Chris Hood with me here. He's an author, a strategist, and a consultant in this space. He recently wrote a new book. Welcome to the show, Chris.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah, Chris, do you want to give the audience a quick introduction about yourself?
Sure. Yeah, my name is Chris Hood. I'm a digital strategist and author, new author, which I love to say now. I've been in the API space for about 10 years. And before this, I worked for Google and spent about 6 years working with Apogee and developing strategies around API management and all of the various elements that go into that, everything from API ecosystems to developer platforms and monetization strategies. And I've worked with companies around the world understanding what are APIs and how will APIs help you in your business to grow business value. And so, again, very excited. This is a topic that I love talking about. So I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, likewise, and we're glad to have you. So maybe you could give us a quick overview about the book you wrote, what inspired you to write it, and kind of what are the key topics that it addresses?
Yeah. Well, the book is called Customer Transformation. And this is actually a play on words, really, for anybody who's familiar with digital transformation. But if we look at the evolution of digital transformation, something that has become overly simplified and has lost its original meaning, digital transformation was originally intended to understand how to evolve technologies to meet the continuing expectations, demands, needs of your customers. Because what we saw was customers were adopting technologies at a faster rate than the businesses were able to keep up with it. So, because it lost its meaning, I wanted to replace that focus on the customer and build a strategy around how to understand that your customer is first and foremost the most important aspect of your business. And then from there, how do you evolve and continue to adjust your processes, your culture, your technologies to meet up with the continuing expectations of consumers? And I think you see on the screen right here, there are 7 stages in that transformation process that start with the customer and then go through to the business. What's interesting is for our conversation today, you'll see that the second step there is interfaces. This actually is where APIs come in. You'll also see towards the end of that is technology. Most organizations start like, what's the business want to do? What's the technology we want to produce? And then start to work what we call from the inside out. You're starting from inside your business and working outward to your customer. I want to change that and say, let's start from your customer, figure out how they are going to interact with your business, build APIs that meet those needs, and then flow in to generate business value.
Got it. And so, what's your take on how well digital transformation was executed? Was it completed? And then now, with the advent of AI, is it a new chapter in the digital transformation, kind of in this ongoing journey, or is it a new paradigm shift where basically, we have to switch to something different than kind of digital transformation?
Yeah, I think it's something different. I think I've kind of toyed with it in my head. Digital transformation is dead. That's I know that's kind of a broad statement to make, but if we think about it, there's something like I don't remember the actual stats, but 78% of digital transformation initiatives fail. Why do they fail? Well, they don't have the support, or I would argue they don't actually understand why they're transforming in the first place. And the argument is that you're transforming for your customer, which is why I think my book is so critical, is because it puts that focus that your value propositions, the reason that you're doing this is all in alignment with your customer, right? So when we start thinking about AI and how that is also reflecting in what businesses are going through, that transformation process that we're seeing in organizations, AI is just becoming another tool that is going to allow you to meet consumer needs faster. Automation, personalization, and it doesn't necessarily change the whole rationale. Like, are you bringing in AI to do something in your business, or are you bringing in AI to meet the needs of your customers? The argument is always going to be it's to meet the needs of your customers. The various metrics that we track, like time to market, yeah, you're okay, great, you're going to get to market faster. Why? To meet the needs of your customers. It will always fall back on the customer.
Do you see any indicators that customers are again pulling ahead with AI ahead of where the enterprises that serve those customers are? What would be
Yeah,
some of those indicators you're seeing?
yeah, I think that's a very good question, because that goes back to the principles of digital transformation. When consumers are engaged with that technology at an accelerated rate or faster than the company is able to keep up with, we've got that transformation requirement. I think in this case, in terms of AI, I think we're so new to it that consumers are using it, but I still don't believe they fully understand the what it is, what it does, what it's capable of. And so I think we're at a position where the businesses and companies have an opportunity to accelerate AI and get ahead of it in order to keep up with the demands that consumers have. The good news, I guess, is that consumers still have basic expectations. I want to be able to engage with you on the device of my choice, and we can definitely talk about different ways that we engage with companies now. Um, I want to buy something. I want support, right? And AI is definitely helping in all of those areas. I think the challenge that we're seeing from a business perspective is, at what expense? Do we want to fully automate, or do we begin to lose some of that human touch that I think consumers still expect? So you have to understand what that balance is, and not, just add technology or AI to automate, for the sake of consumer expectations, when they may not have those same expectations right now.
Yeah, no, and it's interesting because the AI can actually manifest itself as representing both parties and potentially both simultaneously. Where if in the traditional sense, it was like I, as an enterprise, am going to build something, and that thing is going to be mine, and that thing is going to serve my customers. So it's not the customer that owns the application; they just simply use the enterprise's application to accomplish something. Now, with AI, especially with things like the ChatGPT plugins model and other models to follow, it becomes kind of a gray zone. If you build a plugin for the AI, but the customer actually pays for the AI service to represent them, then this AI agent actually works on behalf of the customer to interface with your company. Versus if you engage AI to represent you as a company, and then you embed it inside your application, then this AI represents you as a customer, or sorry, as an enterprise, and serves your needs. Any thoughts on how this like new introduction of having AI work on behalf of the customer and not on behalf of the enterprise could change things and change the paradigm in the game?
Yeah, it's a fabulous example. I mean, if we think about interfaces, we used to call them touch points, which were actually what they sound like: physical touching of an application like a mobile device or ATM machine or kiosk at a checkout, right? You go and touch, and that was your touch point. That was your interface between the customer and the business. Now, with multisensory types of applications, virtual reality, visual, hearing, speech. I can talk to my Google Home or Alexa device and ask it to do something. I don't have to actually touch anything. It's a new way to interface with that business. We're also starting to see really crazy things with smell and taste. There was a Japanese professor who invented Taste TV, which is actually a lickable screen. You go and lick it, and in theory, what's on the screen, you can taste what's there. It's using different types of taste and senses. Right? So when we start getting into virtual reality and the such, how are we going to augment all of those different senses to be able to engage with the business from a consumer perspective? AI has just become another one of those interfaces with a business. And how you do that, it could be any number of things. We see services like Ulta Beauty, as an example. Ulta Beauty has created an AI powered makeup try on, virtual makeup try on. So you can go and you can try on different shades of makeup, and it's doing facial recognition and making recommendations on color tones and palettes. All of that just by AI and visual AI. That's an interface with the business, right? You could call that a plug-in. You could call it whatever you want, but ultimately it's an interface. A Chat GPT plugin is just another interface for a consumer to engage with you in some way. And if we look at all of the different types of AI products that have materialized, everything from writing, or even products that we are already using. Web developers are using like WordPress, and now all of a sudden you've got AI embedded into WordPress through a plugin to help you generate web pages. You've got services like Grammarly, which is one of the best grammar checking applications out there that now has AI built into it to help expand their offerings and provide more robust grammar checking, right? So I think those types of interfaces, again, are what you have to think about. And the beauty of all of this is, in my opinion, the beauty of all of this is even though you have that uh, plugin, AI plugin, there's an API sitting behind it somewhere to help generate it or to help further that interface between the consumer and the business.
Right. No, yeah, and having those two classes where, and I know this is an oversimplification, but treating some of the AIs as almost like employees working for you as a company, and then treating other AIs as agents representing the end person who's your customer. You'll have to actually think about those two classes differently and set your APIs up differently for the two, where you don't have full control over the one that shows up on behalf of a customer. So interesting. Switching into APIs, I imagine that at an enterprise, it's different teams that put together the different aspects that ends up assembling into the customer's experience and the customer's journey. How can the team that's responsible for the APIs basically set the enterprise up for success when they can't yet predict all the different consumption use cases and consumers and classes of consumers that are going to end up using those APIs?
That's a big question. Um, there's a lot of different ways you could look at that, right? So there is one argument that you could say, if you look at traditional software development, I think APIs follow a traditional software development lifecycle, whether you do it in an agile or scrum type of method. You can iterate on those APIs. The basic premise, though, is that you're building APIs that are already intended to meet a specific purpose. And where do you understand that purpose? You're doing the research. You're asking, customers, what do they want? You're trying to design that program. And then obviously you need to design APIs that are going to deliver that experience back to the consumers. So if you're taking that kind of approach where I've got an agile team, I understand what my backlog is, I understand that backlog is prioritized based on stakeholder requirements. Those stakeholder requirements should have some level of understanding of what the experience is that you want to build. And then how you organize that team internally, that's a whole nother conversation as well, because what you'll usually find is you'll have one team over here working on one element of experience, and then another team over here working on a completely different type of product or experience. And then you end up with this crossover. I'll overly simplify it and use, locations. You have a retail company that is building an application, and they're building two different types of applications for two different types of experiences, and they want to create a locations API. Well, then they go off and both are creating a locations API. Well, why are you doing that? You should have some centralized repository or library of APIs that show what has already been created so that you don't duplicate your effort. And I think one of the things that Poly is doing, which is really fascinating, is that you could do that discovery so that if you have shared experienced APIs out there, you're not duplicating efforts between cross functional teams or cross productized teams. That reduces time, because now the biggest challenge is that replication of issue and building things. The other side of this, real quickly, is you have different interpretations also of what consumers want. And in that interpretation, you'll often have different opinions, creating basically, in theory, the exact same API, but in different ways. If you can bring that together and see how to collaborate on that centralized experience, maybe there's a benefit to having that centralized library again, to facilitate it.
Yeah, and it's interesting there where one of the kind of old questions in APIs is like, who owns the presentation APIs? Is that the service provider or is that the consumer? And it can go both ways. There's no definitive answer on who should be building those. But I think the magic of what we're creating with Poly is that regardless of who creates it, they can both publish it to the catalog so that it's discoverable by others. And those others might use it as is, or they might take the code, modify it, make it their own, and accomplish it. But at each step of the way, both in terms of publishing the backend system API as well as publishing the presentation APIs, you save that work that was done so that future consumers can pick it up and create derivatives off of it. Curious, how would you describe to somebody that's maybe non-technical the benefits of having your APIs really easily consumable? Would
Hmm.
and I see both sides of the equation. There's maybe, and I'd love for you to touch on both. One side is the benefits of being able to move faster. What are those to a business? And then secondarily, the benefits of being able to do it at a lower cost.
Yeah, I mean, I think they both are really the same. Look, my argument is can we get to a point where you develop an API that doesn't need documentation? Now, that's a bold statement as well, right? Because I think most people, especially in software development, they think, well, software documentation, right? It's they go hand in hand. You can't do both. And the old cliche argument is, what happens if somebody, gets hit by a bus? Hopefully, no one gets hit by a bus today. But right, you need that documentation so somebody else can come in. My argument would be, what if the API was so freaking easy to understand that you knew exactly what it did just by looking at the URI? And in theory, that's what we have to get to. They have to be so simple that I can look at it and know what it does. Now, there may be other background logistics in there, right? Like, what's the security layer? What's the structure? What's in the header? There could be some elements that have to have documentation, unless you standardize all of that, in which case all you do is have a standardized document that is applied to all of your APIs, which would also be recommended. But I think the mindset of being able to simplify it to a point where anybody who looks at it knows what it does is the ideal goal. I've walked into a lot of organizations and they say, "Yeah, we have an API that does whatever. It's called, get TRS-80 report." TRS-80. That was a Radio Shack, wasn't it? I think that was one of their first computers. Anyways, get TRS-80 report, And I said, well, what's the get TRS-80 report? And they're like, oh, that's like a checking account application. I was like, well, then call it a checking account application. Like, no one knows what your internal terminology and, whatever it is. Like, we have so many internal, phrases for things. You understand that, but as soon as you begin to expose those APIs externally to an ecosystem or external developers, or begin to monetize them, sell them, then those external people have no clue what they are. So that would be my argument. And that's going to save you time. That's going to save you costs. That's going to save you in a lot of areas.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Just like resource naming, using the right methods, attributes, the payload structure of the attributes, like just doing that stuff in an intuitive way helps a tremendous amount. And with regards to your point about documentation not being necessary, um, I, I I tend to agree that I also see a world where developers no longer have to sit there and write the documentation. Like I think that paradigm has like pivoted, and now it's like it's up to the tools and the platforms to catch up. What we've done at Poly is we've made it so that if you show the API working to the AI, then the AI can generate the documentation as needed using the programming language of your choice, using the human language of your choice to address your question with regards to that API. So rather than this paradigm of, first you document it, then somebody reads it, they hopefully understand it, and then they can answer their own question, we're switching the paradigm to having the AI be the one that interprets it and then answers your question. Any thoughts on that as a paradigm?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's just about getting things simplified enough. Look, if we were to take any API right now and feed it into, say, Open API, ChatGPT, and say, provide me documentation with this API, it's probably going to be 90% correct. There's going to be some other things in there that we've got to massage a little bit. But I think you're absolutely right. We should be at a point where code, and especially when we start thinking about like low code, no code types of environments, and definitely inside of API management, that we have the technology today to analyze and self document as we're programming. Like I should be able to open up Python right now, begin developing something, and Python is like doing documentation in the side automatically. Like that's a no brainer. So I think that helps. And I also think that because once that documentation is understood by the AI, that when we start using things like chat and looking for agents for support, I can ask the simple question like, "How does this API work? Like, what am I missing?" And it can analyze and give you feedback, like, "Have you tried this?" Or "It's meant to be this," or those intricacies of security and headers and things like that we talked about earlier. Uh, I also think, though, that there is a balance in here, not only of AI helping improve the documentation, managing the documentation, helping us search the documentation, directing us in the right place of the documentation, that the overall reduction of that documentation is also probably something that most people should consider. And I see there's a question down here, like how simple of an API could that be? Like this is logic, I feel. For example, I used locations earlier. If I say get locations, I think we could all automatically assume what that is. I want to get a list of addresses of the locations of my buildings or retail stores, right? Like, does that really need documentation? Are we going through the effort of producing documentation just for the sake of producing documentation? In most cases, yes.
Right, right. Yeah, no, and the question further expands on what style of API lends itself to being, so simple that you just know what it does. And I think there's maybe a misconception around you just look at it and you understand it versus it's so intuitive that as you try it, you learn it,
Mm,
right? And so I think
yeah.
this element of like trying and seeing the response is really what makes it easy. Now, the single kind of biggest thing I think is missing in REST clients or API clients is this like predictive kind of type ahead, right? Like it'd be nice if you could express intent and have it be like, oh, you're actually looking for this query parameter to address that. And so I think that the tooling has to step it up to the next level. But in terms of the API design, I tend to be in the camp that I think REST APIs are the simplest. The downside of them is that you tend to have to make multiple calls to go get, parts of one resource from, or sorry, parts of the information from one resource, the other parts from another resource. Then you have to join it, then you have to merge it, and so that's where GraphQL layers in really nicely to tie them together and give you exactly what you're looking for. But I think GraphQL is like kind of once you know what you want, it makes it easier. But I think the tooling can really help in helping people kind of almost like the experience. I don't know if you use GitHub Copilot, where it's like it starts to like recommend what you're looking for
Yeah.
based on your intentions.
Yeah. You bring up an interesting idea in there, though. Like, I think anybody who is the developer who's listening, again, you go into Python, you start, developing code. It can predict what, it puts the parentheses and places that, to make sure that you're covered. Like that predictive style of programming, and definitely in the low code and no code, it's helping you along the way. And you're right. From an experience point of view, that is not necessarily there. So I guess a question back to you, Darko, is how might we build that? I'll give you a good example here. Let's say I'm McDonald's and I have a suite of APIs and I want my developers to be able to predict within the realm of experiences for McDonald's. I don't want the AI then to say, well, let's ask them for a banking account information, right? That's out of the realm of the experience within McDonald's. So, could we build that experience a framework in a way so that as the API is being developed, it's making recommendations that meet those specific requirements that have already been established?
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's kind of two or three parts to that equation. So one is at the time of designing, I think the AI should be playing a role in recommending the resource structure, the payload structure, et cetera. And it should be tapping into the existing catalog that the company has so that you drive towards consistency rather than potentially diverge from it. And then once it's been created and the consumers show up to use it, it should also be able to help them predict from the set of what's available what it should look like. Now, the third part that gets a little more fuzzy, and I don't know that we're quite there yet technically, is when a user can just call whatever the resource they think it should be, and the AI knows behind the scenes what that thing really is. At that point, you have, we've used this term loose coupling in the past, but I think there's now a looser degree of loose coupling that's possible where the mapping in between is not actually hard coded, but it actually evolves, and it can evolve based on the needs of the consumer. So you have like kind of true polymorphism where every consumer can come in and ask for what they want, and then it's the role of the AI in the middle to bridge the gap between what it is. And I know that scares a lot of people. It scares me. I'm sure there's a lot more to be done there, but it's not so far fetched that I can't imagine it happening in at least in our lifetime, if not kind of in the next decade.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that goes in line with, kind of this philosophy on the evolution of APIs. So if we kind of look over the course of history, APIs have been around for a long time, 60, 70 plus years. And if we go back and we start to kind of do this evolution, API started as really as connectors, as integration points, go get data, right? Then they moved to more or less a component, right? You can have multiple API components that are bridging the gaps inside of applications. Then we get to this concept of API is helping building platforms. Obviously, we look at Facebook as an example of a platform that was built leveraging APIs, bringing in multitudes of different experiences. As we progress, we then get into like APIs as ecosystems, Amazon being probably the best example of that. obviously spread out across multiple different types of businesses. And then if I kind of look towards the future, and that future is clearly starting now, I see APIs as becoming more intelligent, right? APIs are going to be at a position where they understand the data. We theoretically they could be self-integrating. Why have an integration mechanism when the API can self-integrate when it needs to, as it needs to? um, I see them being able to distribute themselves across ecosystems. I think there's a trust layer in there. But if we compare it against, something like cloud containers, containers can spin up, spin down, self-replicate, go between on-prem and hybrid and cloud, change between cloud providers as needed. I don't see APIs being much different than that over the course of, say, the next 5, 10 years.
Yeah, and the part that's absolutely here today is the part where you referred to it as self-integrate. So today, with the ChatGPT plugin model, you can give it a portfolio of API options, ask it to do something for you. It will self-select the right API and figure out how to call it based on the schema, get the response, interpret the response, and answer your question. So that same kind of capability exists through OpenAI in their functions model, which you can do that where instead of the interface being ChatGPT, the interface is an API to OpenAI that uses that routing capability of the functions model. So that part is it's there. The downside of it is it's slow because it's
Yeah.
using AI to do the interpretation at every call. Like it just wouldn't work for I'd say many, if not most use cases. The magic that needs to happen is that the AI needs to be able to build that integration at runtime and then step out of the way and have it flow and monitor it and only get back involved when it needs to tune or correct something or a new call that it hasn't done before comes in.
Yeah.
That part of the equation has not been done yet. We do have another question here talking about kind of the best form of documentation when a use case spans across multiple APIs. How can this be described without documentation, and how can Poly help? So I think that I want to make sure people don't imagine a world where there isn't kind of content for a consumer to understand what the API does and how it works. Like that part I think is going to always be there. The question is, when did that content get created? And I'm in the camp, and maybe this is a very new camp, but I think there's a camp developing that says that content is generated at the time that the user needs it, which means you don't have this notion of like static documentation that needs to be versioned, maintained, updated, etc. It's really just created at the time that the question is asked. So that's using generative AI capabilities. Now, the power of what Poly's trying to do, and I'll explain kind of where we are today and what we accomplished and what's still left to be done, is that you can have a catalog of totally disparate APIs from different sources, and they all live together in this catalog. And they could be external partner APIs, they could be vendor APIs, they could be internal custom built APIs. And the way Poly learned them is that we watched you use them today through Postman, in the future through other clients as well. And so now that Poly has seen the API working and captured a snapshot of it, it knows how to use it because it leverages OpenAI to interpret how to use it. The same way that the plugins model knows how to use APIs at runtime. Now, that catalog can contain multiple sets of APIs from different sources. And then what Poly does is based on your questions and your intent, it figures out which APIs are relevant to the equation, passes all of them to generative AI with their response type definitions, their expected arguments, etc., and uses it to generate a cross API response. And so that's possible today with Poly at beta, and you're welcome to try it yourself. Where we still have some work to do is to manage better the intent of the request. And so it works really well with one API, two APIs, three APIs, and that's kind of where it starts to teeter off. And we can get into why, like, that's kind of our limitation that we're hitting today. And when I say 1, 2, 3, it's 1, 2, 3 combined in a single use case. You can have a catalog of thousands. That's not the problem. So the real breakthrough that needs to happen is we need to pivot from prompt engineering to embeddings, where you basically can use embeddings models with the highest order GPT-4 kind of brain or processor or LLM. Once those two comes together, then you could in theory have basically your own derivative on top of GPT-4 that knows your entire catalog intimately, and it's not at the time of the question that that catalog is being searched and injected. It just intimately knows it at the time that you ask it, so it doesn't have to do this processing. So in other words, that'll become faster, and it'll help us break through this barrier of like a handful of APIs. But to the person who asked this question, even if you ask one at a time and then you grab the results and interpret them yourself, you're still way ahead of having to find the right developer portals, logging in, finding the right resource, finding the right method, reading the docs. Like you're still, hours faster at accomplishing it with Poly today. It's just that, I want to take it down from a 10-minute exercise to a 30-second exercise, and we're just not there yet.
I think there's a couple of interesting things in here. First off, I think there's, when we talk about documentation, there should be a clarification also as to what the documentation is for. So when I hear multiple APIs to develop a use case, well, I look at those as actually two different things. I think the APIs have functionality within the use case, and each one of those APIs have some level of documentation for what those individual APIs do. And then you have a journey, like a customer journey. And across that customer journey, they may be engaging with different APIs during the course of, activities. And so you can map that out as to what that journey looks like. But what you said earlier is being able to get the documentation when you need the documentation at the moment of that. It reminded me of like if you've ever logged into a new application. A lot of applications have kind of the walkthrough and a little text box pops up and it says like step 1, this is where your information is, and step 2, this is where you go to do this, right? And we have that kind of mentality of a walkthrough. Imagine an API sandbox that as you are typing, the API is being developed and you know what's going on. But at a moment that you don't know what's going on, a little pop up box says, oh, this is what we mean in this particular section. That's real time documentation for you that an AI can provide to you because the AI recognizes you may be struggling at this moment. So I'm going to provide you with the documentation that you need for this element that you're currently struggling on. I think that's a fabulous way to look at this.
Yeah, no, and the other big thing that's amazed me with the AI is it's built off the corpus of basically, I don't know if all or much of human public text. It really understands kind of domain specific concepts, such that, like, for example, I was working with the logistics company and Polly serves up a logistics, payload for a logistics call. And there's logistics specific terminology in the response type. And I don't know what those things are. Polly doesn't know what those things are. But because Polly sits on GPT-4, GPT-4 does. And so now Polly can still answer questions that are nuanced logistics questions about a particular payload element that is thanks to OpenAI and really like. But what Polly did there is it basically gave OpenAI the information that it can then cross correlate against its base knowledge to answer that pointed question. So there's stuff like that too that I think it's going to change the game. Whereas in documentation, now if you did it the traditional way, you would have to write the explanation on your dev portal for what these terms are. And many times the technical writer you hire is not a domain expert, right? And so now you have this like challenge that has always been there of like, how do you accurately explain what the, not just the API does, but what the actual payload means, what these elements mean, and how do you articulate that to a person? And then how do you articulate it in other languages, right? Japanese. It's like, good luck,
Yeah.
Traditional way versus what you can accomplish with AI today.
And I would like to clarify here. just because it can do that doesn't mean you should take your TRS 80 report and then build documentation as to what it really means. Like, still use the terminology
Right.
that most people are aware of. But I do think you could also have, like, Chat GPT as an example. If it's a logistics term, you could provide additional definitions. Just have a hyperlink, you scroll over that, and you can have it be then interpreted or simplified. One of the great things to do with Chat GPT is like explain molecular biology to a fourth grader, right?
Right.
And now you get those terminology simplified for you.
No, and there's a lot of kind of rehabbing that's going to need to happen on APIs and um, like for example, when an AI agent accesses your API, it's going to try its best to understand what the payload means. But going back to your point, if the payload is intuitive, its probability of understanding it is going to be much, 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 much better. And so that's super important when you're building AI connectivity. You want your payload elements to be like super literal. And like, developers like acronyms, the abbreviations and things of that sort. And they want the payloads to be nice and tight and concise. But with AI, you have a little bit more affordance. You can use full text words. You can have payload elements that have, I know it looks ugly. I know a lot of people don't like to look at it, but it's like you can have like a 40 character name for this payload element. As long as it's extremely precise, that's going to improve the probability that the AI agent can just run with it and know exactly what it is, know how to format it, etc. So there is going to be a whole new, I think, design of APIs that are intended for AI agents versus developers, and that's going to be a whole new, you know, game that's opening up. So, Chris, yeah, we're approaching kind of the end of time here. Any closing remarks you'd like to add? And if there are any other questions from the audience, now's a kind of last call on posting those.
Yeah, definitely open to taking any other questions. But no, I mean, like I said from the start, the API space is fascinating. It's continuing to evolve. I think what I've seen from Polly and what Polly is doing is fabulous. And it really goes into these concepts of how do we make the APIs themselves more intelligent? And how do we simplify the development of APIs to ultimately create new experiences much easier, much faster, and then deliver those to consumers? One of the things that I think is on the horizon from APIs is our ability to integrate between experiences. So if you think of let's just take a basic business trip. And during the business trip, you are going to engage with multiple different applications doing multiple different things, right? To overly simplify it, you've got your airline, you've got your rental car, you've got your hotel. In theory, three different apps doing three different things across three different environments. Most of those companies are focused on the customer journey at that level. Like the airline only cares about the customer journey for the airline. The hotel only cares about the customer journey for the hotel, right? Et cetera. What if those APIs could integrate that experience across, so that, let's say your flight is delayed and in midair you have reservations for a restaurant? Why couldn't the airline send a notification to the restaurant and change your uh, reservation time in real time, because the flight knows and the API is connected and the experiences are connected? And I think that type of thought process, where we can interconnect, leveraging APIs, the experiences of consumers to make all of our lives easier, is definitely right there for us to begin developing. And I encourage everyone who's listening, besides trying Poly API beta, everybody who's listening to think about how they can integrate across platforms with their APIs so that they can get a more seamless experience for consumers.
Awesome. Yeah, one more question came in, talking about authorization issues becoming kind of across multiple APIs. Yeah, so that's a big problem where basically different APIs are secured by different authorization services, and they use different standards and they have different scopes and things of that sort. So what we did at Poly to address this is we allow you to register your authorization provider that's going to be operating at the Poly layer. And then what we can also do is register authorization providers that operate down at the API level. And so what Poly can do is not only can Poly functions be secured by your authorization provider of choice, you can actually use it to obtain access tokens from the downstream authorization providers, depending on the function that you're accessing, such that the end user's identity could be propagated through Poly down to the downstream API. And I know that could maybe flew over people's heads if you're not kind of an OAuth, I don't know, expert or user, but that's been a problem that's plaguing integrations for way too long, in my opinion, is the inability to propagate the end user's identity all the way down through to the actual service, and to do it in such a way where the end user can log in just in time with the authorization service that protects the ultimate end resource. So I've done 2 videos on that. I would encourage you to go take a look at them. One is a kind of a generic web app, and then the other one is how you can do just-in-time authorization with authorization providers within a ChatGPT conversation. So absolutely, Paul, you can help with that use case. Awesome. Well, thanks all. I think we'll wrap it up here. Chris, thank you for having us. Real quick for the audience, where's the best place to get your book?
Yeah, my book. Hoot! Look at that. I've got it right in my hand. You can get the book either on Amazon. That's probably the easiest way to get it today. You can go to Amazon.com and do a quick search of customer transformation, and you should be able to find it. Or you can go to my website, chrishood.com, and there's a link there that you can buy it with a link back to Amazon to help you get there faster. So lots of different ways to buy it. And if you have any questions along the way, you can just reach out to me via my website. Reach out, let me know how I can help.
And is it available both paperback and hardcover and digital?
Yep, paperback, hardcover, and Kindle and digital.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you, Chris. Really appreciate you taking the time to come talk with us, and thank you to the audience for attending. And we look to forward to having you back in future episodes.
Thanks so much.